What if a faith that now has 2 billion followers was almost wiped out just a few years after it began? What if a message that would shape civilizations for over 1,400 years was nearly silenced forever in the sands of a lonely valley? Outnumbered 3-1, a small community of believers, chased from their homes and robbed of their wealth, stood before a battle-hardened army with a single goal: to erase them from the face of the earth. This isn't just the story of a battle. It's the story of a desperate clash in the desert that would secure the future of Islam. This is the story of Badr. In the early 7th century, the city of Mecca was the commercial and cultural heart of Arabia. Its power belonged to the elite Quraysh tribe, who guarded the sacred Kaaba and controlled the profitable caravan routes. It was into this world that a man from their own tribe, Muhammad ibn Abdullah, introduced a radical new message. For 13 years, Prophet Muhammad preached a simple but revolutionary idea. There is only one God, and all people, rich or poor, chief or servant, are equal in his eyes. This message was a direct challenge to the polytheistic beliefs that propped up Mecca's entire social and economic order. For the Quraysh, this wasn't just heresy. It threatened their power, their wealth, and their very way of life. Their response was brutal. The early Muslims, a small and vulnerable group, were relentlessly persecuted. They were mocked in public, cut off financially, and physically tortured. Some were dragged over scorching sands with heavy rocks crushing their chests. Others, like the family of Yasir, were martyred in the open, their only crime refusing to renounce their new faith. The persecution became so intense that life in Mecca was simply unlivable. Facing the threat of total annihilation, the Prophet organized a desperate escape. In 622 CE, the Muslims began the Hijra, a 200-mile journey north to the oasis city of Yathrib, soon to be known as Medina. They left everything behind: their homes, their property, and their ancestral ties, arriving as refugees called the Muhajirun, or the emigrants. In Medina, they were welcomed by the local tribes who had embraced Islam, known as the Ansar, or the Helpers. Together they formed a new community, the Ummah, bound not by blood, but by shared faith. Still, their existence was fragile. They were a displaced people in a new city, dealing with internal conflicts and threats from nearby tribes. And to the south, the shadow of the Quraysh loomed large. The lords of Mecca hadn't forgotten them. They saw the new Muslim community not as a minor nuisance, but as a growing threat that had to be destroyed. For 2 years, the tension simmered, a cold war of raids and hostility. The Muslims were on a knife's edge, their survival far from certain. They had escaped the fire of Mecca, only to find themselves on the brink of extinction. In the spring of 624 CE, word reached Medina of an opportunity that could change everything. A massive Quraysh merchant caravan, loaded with wealth, was returning from Syria, led by one of Mecca's most powerful chiefs, Abu Sufyan. For the Muslims, this wasn't an act of banditry, which was common in Arabia. It was a matter of justice and survival. Much of the wealth in that caravan was the very property the Quraysh had illegally seized from the Muhajirun when they fled Mecca. Intercepting it was a chance to reclaim what was stolen and to strike a vital economic blow against the tribe that still wanted them destroyed. Prophet Muhammad gathered what forces he could, but the response was modest. Only about 313 men answered the call. This was no professional army. They were a volunteer force of farmers, merchants, and craftsmen. They were poorly equipped, with only 2 horses and 70 camels for the entire group, which they rode in turns. They were setting out to raid a caravan and its 40 guards, not to fight a full-scale war. As this small band marched out of Medina toward the strategic wells of Badr, they had no idea that they were walking, not toward a simple raid, but into a confrontation that would be immortalized in their holy book as Yawm al-Furqan, the day of the criterion that would forever separate truth from falsehood. Abu Sufyan was a sharp and cautious leader. As his caravan moved south, his scouts warned him of the Muslim plan. Realizing the danger, he acted fast, sending a messenger named Damdam ibn Amr racing to Mecca with a desperate plea for help. The story goes that when Damdam arrived, he cut the ears and nose of his camel, tore his shirt, and screamed that the caravan, and with it, the wealth and honor of the Quraysh, was about to be lost. Mecca was thrown into a panic. The news ignited the tribe's pride and deep-seated hatred. An army was mobilized with incredible speed, assembling nearly 1,000 men, a terrifying force for its time. They had 100 horses for their cavalry, hundreds of camels, and warriors decked out in chainmail and armor. This wasn't a rescue party. It was an army bent on annihilation. Leading them was the Prophet's most bitter enemy, a man known as Abu Jahl, the father of ignorance. While the Quraysh army marched north, Abu Sufyan pulled off a brilliant maneuver. He diverted his caravan off the main road, taking a lesser-known coastal path to successfully evade the Muslims. He then sent a second message to the approaching army. "You came to protect your caravan, your men, and your property. God has saved them, so go back." The caravan was safe. The reason for the mission was gone. For a moment, the Quraysh leaders debated. Some argued for returning to Mecca, seeing no reason for bloodshed. But Abu Jahl, the arrogant and powerful warlord, wouldn't hear of it. His pride was on the line. He declared, "By God, we will not go back until we have been to Badr." He imagined a great show of force. He wanted to feast for 3 days, slaughter camels, and have the army's singers and dancers proclaim their might, so all of Arabia would hear of their strength and forever fear the Quraysh. It wasn't a strategic decision. It was born of pure arrogance. He wasn't just marching to Badr to make a point. He was marching to erase Islam from existence. And so, the army of pride continued its advance, heading straight into a destiny they couldn't possibly imagine. As the 2 armies closed in on the valley of Badr, the reality of the situation crashed down on the Muslims. A scout returned with horrifying news. The caravan was gone, and in its place was the entire Quraysh army, outnumbering them 3-1. They weren't facing 40 guards, they were facing 1,000 of Arabia's most formidable warriors. Fear rippled through the ranks. They were unprepared, under-equipped, and hopelessly outmatched. Understanding the gravity of the moment, Prophet Muhammad gathered his followers for a council of war. He needed to know if they were truly with him. He turned to his companions for their counsel. The leaders of the Muhajirun, the emigrants from Mecca, stood and pledged their unwavering support. But the Prophet's question was implicitly aimed at the Ansar, the helpers of Medina. Their pledge of allegiance was to defend him within Medina's walls. They had never sworn to follow him into an offensive battle in the open desert. This was the moment of truth. A leader of the Ansar, Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, stood and gave an answer that would echo through Islamic history. "O Messenger of God," he said, We have believed in you and testified that what you have brought is the truth. So go where you wish, for we are with you. By the one who sent you with the truth, if you were to lead us into the sea, we would plunge into it with you, and not a single man would remain behind." The prophet's face lit up. With the loyalty of his followers confirmed, he gave the order to advance. In a brilliant strategic move, he led his men to the wells of Badr, and on the advice of his companion, Hubab ibn al-Mundhir, positioned his small army to control the valley's main water source, a critical advantage in the desert. That night, the 17th of Ramadan, a strange calm fell over the Muslim camp. A light rain began to fall, later described in the Quran as a blessing that firmed the sand under their feet and let many of them sleep peacefully. In the Quraysh camp, that same rain turned the ground to mud, adding to their frustration. But the prophet didn't sleep. He stood alone in a small hut, praying with an intensity his companions had never seen. He raised his hands, his voice choked with emotion, pleading with God. He prayed, "O Allah, if this small band of believers is destroyed today, you will not be worshipped on earth again. O Allah, grant me the victory you have promised me." It was a prayer that laid the stakes bare. In the prophet's eyes, the very future of God's message on earth hinged on the next sunrise. As dawn broke, the two armies lined up. The Quraysh, a forest of iron, looked down on the small, sparse line of believers. The battle didn't start with a chaotic charge, but with an Arab tradition, a duel of champions. 3 of the Quraysh's finest warriors strode forward. Utbah ibn Rabi'ah, his brother Shayba, and his son Walid. They roared a challenge for single combat. 3 of the Ansar from Medina stepped out, but the Meccans shouted back arrogantly, "We have no business with you. Send out our noble equals from our own tribe." The prophet then called on his own kinsman, his uncle, the lion-like Hamza, his young, fearless cousin, Ali ibn Abi Talib, and his older cousin, Ubaidah ibn al-Harith. The clash was swift and brutal. Hamza struck down Shayba. The young Ali quickly dispatched Walid. Ubaidah and Utbah battled, wounding each other. Ali and Hamza rushed to help, cutting down Utbah, but Ubaidah had been mortally wounded, his legs severed in the duel. The Muslims had won the opening clash, but at a cost. Enraged by the fall of their champions, the Quraysh army unleashed a volley of arrows and charged, their full force crashing against the Muslim line. The battle turned into a desperate melee of clashing swords and splintering shields. Pushed back by sheer numbers, the Muslim line bent, and for a moment, it seemed it would break. At this critical point, Prophet Muhammad returned to his hut, fell to his knees, and repeated his plea, "O Allah, grant me the victory you promised." His closest companion, Abu Bakr, stood with him, his heart breaking for his friend. "O Prophet of God," he said, "your prayer to your Lord will be answered." Suddenly, the prophet's demeanor changed. He lifted his head, resolute, and declared, "The help of Allah has come." He then picked up a handful of dust and, facing the Quraysh, hurled it at them, shouting, "May their faces be disfigured!" In that instant, historical accounts and the Quran describe a blinding dust storm that whipped into the faces of the Quraysh. The Quran also states that God sent down thousands of angels, unseen by most, who rode into battle and struck fear into the enemy's hearts. Whether seen as a divine miracle or a sudden morale-shifting event, the tide of battle turned instantly. Infused with new courage, the small Muslim army surged forward, smashing the Quraysh lines and breaking their will to fight. One by one, the arrogant Meccan leaders who had pushed for war began to fall. And then came the death of Abu Jahl. The architect of so much persecution was brought down. His fall symbolized the shattering of Quraysh's pride. With their leaders dead and their ranks in chaos, the mighty army broke and fled in a panic. When the dust settled, it revealed a scene of stunning, almost unbelievable victory. Against all odds, the small band of Muslims had defeated the most powerful tribe in Arabia. The Quraysh lost 70 of their most prominent leaders and warriors, and another 70 were taken captive. The Muslims lost only 14 martyrs. The victory was more than just military, it was profoundly spiritual. For the early Muslims, it was irrefutable proof that God was on their side. Their faith, tested in battle, was now an unbreakable certainty. In the aftermath, the Prophet established rules for treating prisoners that were revolutionary for the time. He ordered that they be fed and clothed properly, often better than their Muslim captors. Many were later ransomed, and those who were literate could earn their freedom by teaching 10 Muslim children to read and write. This mercy was a stark contrast to the Quraysh's prior brutality. When news of the devastating defeat reached Mecca, the city was plunged into shock and grief. The army that had marched out with such arrogance was now humiliated. Its prestige was shattered, its leadership decimated, and its economic dominance broken. For the Muslim community, everything had changed. They were no longer a fugitive sect on the verge of being crushed. The victory at Badr transformed them into a major political and military power in Arabia. Neighboring tribes, who had been watching from the sidelines, now saw Islam not as a losing cause, but as a force to be reckoned with. The authority of Prophet Muhammad as a leader and commander was cemented, boosting morale and attracting new converts to the growing state in Medina. The Battle of Badr was the first of many trials that would shape Islamic history. The story of Islam is filled with these pivotal moments that tested the faith of its followers and changed the world. If you want to explore more of these events, from the near disaster at Uhud to the final conquest of Mecca, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next video. The Battle of Badr was far more than a military victory. It was the turning point that saved Islam from the brink of extinction. It ensured the message of Prophet Muhammad wouldn't be silenced, but would survive to be heard across the world. The Quran calls it Yawm al-Furqan, the day of the criterion, because it drew a clear line between the old world of tribal pride and the new world of faith. It was a victory that vindicated the Muslims' suffering, affirmed their prophet's mission, and gave them the unshakable confidence that God was on their side. From the desperation of that prayer in a small hut, a global civilization would rise. The echoes of that single day in the desert, of 313 believers standing against 1,000, of faith defying impossible odds, continue to resonate through the centuries, a timeless story of how courage, strategy, and unwavering belief can change the course of human history forever.